We're here in Mandan, North Dakota with David Toledo, who's a research rangeland management specialist. David, it's good to be with you. Good to talk to you.
Good to be here.
David's a rangeland ecologist, and so he brings another aspect of soil health to us that perhaps is not something we think about where soil health is often associated just with cropland management. David, can you speak a little bit to that subject about, first of all, what is rangeland health?
So, very glad to be here talking about this because so much of our focus sometimes is on cropland agriculture, and
Yes.
we think of soil health as crops, and we're thinking about that.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
there's this whole other aspect of soil health and rangeland health, which are areas that we really depend on, these rangelands.
Got it.
These are areas that are usually vegetated by grasslands,
Yes.
grass-like plants, forbs, shrubs,
Yes.
and they, apart from providing us food through livestock grazing and things,
Yes.
they also provide us with suite of services or benefits
Yes.
that we're also gaining from. So we get clean air, clean water from these rangelands. There's energy flow through these systems that kind of provide us a lot of the nutrients and a lot of the energy that we need for regular lives. So.
Okay. Well, tell me, how much, when we talk about rangeland, can you describe sort of what that, sort of in general, what that habitat looks like, and how much rangeland in the United States is in private hands? Or is that...
Wow, that's a tough question. I'm not sure anyone...
Or is there a lot of rangeland in private hands? You know, sort of the relative proportion.
It just depends by state, I would say,
Yeah.
because like if we're talking about Texas, like 90-something% of the rangelands there are privately owned.
Okay.
And
so we're not talking that rangeland somehow is just sort of government property.
no, not necessarily, not at
Yeah.
all. So a lot of government owns rangelands, like the Bureau of Land Management,
Right.
Natural Resource Conservation Services. They manage very large portions of land that are in
Yeah.
rangeland. Even the Forest Service through their National Grassland Program.
Yeah, yeah.
These are rangelands, so these very large grasslands, shrublands, sometimes even some of the wooded areas can be considered rangelands, these savanna areas.
Okay.
So there's a very large extent of them in the U.S. and throughout the world.
Right.
So
okay.
things that, like tundra, could be considered a sort of rangeland if you go that far.
Okay.
Florida, which has a lot of wetlands, things like that, that can be a rangeland
Oh,
too.
really?
So.
Okay. All right. Well, if I own rangeland, because a lot of your clientele is going to be the private farmer, and I'm making money off the rangeland, why should I care about this rangeland ecology that seems kind of so divorced really from maybe what I'm doing, is trying to make a decent living out there?
So going back to maybe a little bit of what I said earlier,
Yes.
it's these ecosystem services or the benefits that we as humans can gain from these rangelands. So they provide us with a lot of different things, such as food, livestock,
Got it.
and like clean air and nutrient flow, energy flow, things like that. And these healthy ecosystems kind of sustain our way of life in a way.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay, and when you talk about sustain our way of life as a farmer, again, I'm looking towards, you know, just making money out of that. What's in it for me if I start looking at rangeland health as one of my key goals when I'm looking at my property?
So, I'm thinking about rangeland health, and when we think about rangeland health,
Yes.
we think about these different functions that these rangelands provide, and how we measure them. So we have 17 different indicators when we use specific rangeland health protocols that measure 3 different attributes, which are soil site stability, hydrologic function, biotic integrity.
Okay.
And these all tie in one way or another to soil and soil health.
Okay.
And there's a very close interconnectedness between soils and what we see above that we depend on.
Okay.
So if I'm a rancher that I'm looking at my rangeland and thinking like, hey, why do I care about this range health stuff?
Yeah.
It's the grass that's growing there, the plants that are growing there, and the way they're growing, the quantities that they're growing on, and depends on how healthy that rangeland is. So how water's flowing through that ecosystem, how your below ground and above ground biotic community is working,
yes,
whether you're losing soil through erosion or wind. And all this is connected to what you're actually using from that rangeland, that grass that you might be using to feed your livestock.
Okay.
That depends on all these other things. So there's a very close connection there.
Okay. So if I'm hearing you correctly, the soil is going to be very closely associated with the flow of water through the system, and maybe even the ability of that system to hold water for plants in the next year's growing season, and those plants and animals then will interact. And if I look after that somehow, that ultimately or possibly very soon may begin to benefit me financially as well.
That is true.
Okay.
That is definitely true. So we have to look at how these things are connected. We can't focus only on one aspect of it. Like if we're only focusing on the soil and site stability, like looking at maybe that we're not having some sort of erosion, but at the same time ignoring the whole biotic or how water flows through the environment,
yep,
we're completely neglecting that environment, like the health of that rangeland, because we're focusing on one thing.
Yeah.
While there's a connectedness between all these other things that really matter so that it can produce. So we see that a lot with invasive species too.
Yes.
So we might be focusing too much on an invasive species and focusing on eradicating it, but we might be neglecting or forgetting to think about the soil under it, how it's affecting the soil,
okay,
or how in some cases maybe that invasive species is keeping some of the soil stable.
Okay.
So that
all right,
that might be considered heresy by some, but in some cases it keeps soil stable, and then we have to figure out how that is affecting other parts of the ecosystem.
Okay.
So just think of the whole picture.
Yeah. So and you're an ecologist, so that helps you. I'm a chemist, or I'm a chemical engineer, and I like to think in terms of silos. Okay. Well, that leads me to another question. Let's sort of dig or kind of drill down a little bit. What does soil health have to do with rangeland ecology?
So soil health is very important to rangeland ecology because, as I hope a lot of us know already, or most of us do, soil is the basis for everything that grows on top of it, and a lot of what grows below ground.
Yeah.
So if we don't have that healthy soil supporting these systems, the ecology of the system won't function. There's going to be a break in the system, and then the non-healthy soils won't have healthy environments above it.
So it's not just about soil erosion then. So we're not just concentrating on gullies or maybe sheet and rill erosion with bare patches. We're looking at something deeper.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that is one component. So when we're looking at the soil site stability, for example, that's one of the things we look at, what you just mentioned.
Yeah.
So we're trying to see how to prevent maybe loss or movement of soil because of water or wind.
Yeah.
But then we also have to look at how water is moving through that system. So the ability of an ecosystem to actually capture, retain, and then safely release some of that water for use by plants. And the ability of that ecosystem to prevent the loss of that ability to capture water and release that water safely. And if there is something that does affect that, how it can bounce back to what it should be doing.
Okay. So you're saying that ecosystems are also resilient. They tend to equilibrate.
So that's exactly it. I'm not necessarily equilibrate, but there's some dynamic, some certain dynamics in there, and we can't expect it to be like in an equilibrium, like a static equilibrium. But there's going to be some dynamic there where it kind of goes up and down, and some of the different attributes. But it stays within a certain state where you're maintaining the function of that ecosystem.
Okay. All right. Let's kind of get down to brass tacks. I'm a rangeland. I own rangeland. What are the things that I need to do to protect that rangeland? What are the things that you can tell me about? Simple things that I can do to begin to get rangeland from maybe an unhealthy state to a healthy state.
For me, it all starts with knowing what you have. So a lot of people have rangeland, but they don't really are completely aware of the soils under the rangelands and the plants growing in the rangelands and how these are interacting.
Yes.
So the first thing I would do is find help from Nrcs, your extension agent, or someone at a local university, someone who can help you figure out all of these things. Like a soil survey alone is going to be very helpful, but it won't tell you all of the things you need to know so that you can manage your piece of land appropriately. And you also need to figure out what are your management objectives for the long term. Like you need to know what you want to do with that piece of land, and based on that and what you have, come up with a plan so that you can maintain the flow of benefits that you're getting from that rangeland long term. So if for example, that piece of land that you have, you know what kind of soils it has, what kind of vegetation it has, you can then, there's actually tools, Nrcs has developed a toolbox, a set of tools where you can go online and figure out, well, this is the ecological site I'm in, this is what it's supposed to be, this is what it is right now, and maybe if I do these certain management actions, it could be prescribed grazing, prescribed fire, some other sort of tool or some sort of restoration tool if your land is degraded enough, to kind of bring it back to where it's functioning appropriately based on realistic conditions that are there on the ground right now.
Okay, well, let's go back. You talk about prescribed grazing. Describe to me just briefly what prescribed grazing is, and then why that would be a very healthy thing for a rangeland management program, and what prescribed grazing would be opposed to, you know. So do we start off with lax grazing, or just
just in a simple way of explaining it, would be grazing to reach a specific management objective. And you're not only thinking about livestock production in terms of what you're going to get from that livestock, but also looking at your land and what the future of that land and how you're going to manage grazing in a way that like you can sustainably maintain that land producing. Or that you're grazing to reach some specific management objective, like getting rid of some plant species or changing the composition of the place that you're managing in. So it's usually done by bringing cattle, sometimes a combination of cattle and fire. And it can be, like, it's been used for getting rid of certain noxious species, or it can just be used, like in our case here. We know that if we completely leave an area without grazing, we have this invasive grass, Kentucky bluegrass, Proa pratensis, which will take over. It'll start taking over in the absence of grazing. So a lot of people traditionally think that if you take grazing out of the system, it'll bounce back to what it used to be. But in our case, this invasive species actually making it worse. So we're having an invasion there.
Okay, so give me the reason why. I mean, why are these prairies, these systems designed to have animals on them? So you're saying if we take animals off, that's not good. So why do these systems need animals?
So these rangeland systems naturally evolved with grazers. So there's an interaction between the grazing animal and what is actually growing on there.
So what did that look like 300 years ago?
Hard to tell, but there was probably a mix of a lot of the native grasses, forbs, shrubs, and there was an interaction between them. And it was not, as I told you before, it was not static. There was some dynamic there, like maybe grazers, the native grazers, which for here would be bison, would come by and eat the grass in an area and not in another. Maybe fire would come and burn some other area, and that interaction of areas that would sometimes burn, sometimes get grazed, and sometimes they wouldn't, and just that the dynamics there would provide the ecosystems that we see today. So it's not this static thing, but this interplay of all these different ecological actors there and the different pressures. Okay,
so you'd have large herds move through, eat everything flat, but they might not come back for 3 or 4 years. Or you might have a fire move through and then no disturbance. And so that was the natural ecosystem now. And you're saying if we just take grazing animals out, that's not good for the system either, right?
That's not good for a system either. So and that's where you have to really look. So there's no real prescription that I could tell you right now that if you do this, it's going to work for your land.
Yes.
So it's very context specific, and it matters what you have on your land, what kind of soils, the health of the soils at any point in time, and what's growing on there.
Yeah.
What animals you're going to use, how you want to use them, what are your long-term management goals if you want just a livestock operation or a livestock wildlife operation. So you have to take all these things into account and come up with a system that's going to work for you.
Yeah,
so it's not like a silver bullet approach to management where I can give you one thing and tell you go with it and it's going to work for you and your neighbor and your neighbor and your neighbor. You have to really look at what you have and based on that determine goals and use your tools to get to those management goals that you have.
Yeah. So good rangeland management isn't about a prescribed sort of do X, Y, and Z.
No,
but I'm assuming, going back to what you also said earlier, you're really trying to look at what nature's doing as well. Is that right? And trying to fit in your system with what nature does?
Yes, in a way we are, and that's where some of these management approaches come in. So the prescribed grazing or prescribed fire in some cases, like some of my earlier work, what I did for my dissertation had to do with prescribed fire, and we were looking at how these areas down in the southern plains of the U.S., down in Texas, had been adapted to fire, and fire had been taken out of the system. So you get growth of woody species. So you get junipers growing in there. In some areas you had mesquite. And it would really affect the health of the soils and the ecosystems, everything under them. It would change the hydrology of the area, change soil structure, and you could bring fire back into those systems and kind of start reverting that system back to what it should be. So you're taking something that you knew used to happen, that it's not in that system anymore, and trying to implement it, bring that back, and try to manage for it. But of course, there's a lot of other factors that you have to take into account. It's not the silver bullet approach we have. In the case of fire, there's a lot of social issues going with it that we have to take into account.
Fire is a scary thing, right?
Yeah, so you have to be careful and you have to take all this into account. So it's not only going back to the silver bullet approach. You can't just come up with those tools in your management. You have to also look at what's around you and some of those social issues surrounding that.